Welcome back everyone. So in this last session of chapter 11, we are going to see more about departmentalization, and we are extending it further to learn about the reporting relationships. So here we're mostly going to see two terms, chain of command and span of management. These are related to the accountability and reporting to your supervisors and to subordinates. So let's see how this two works. So here, first of all, we have to understand what is chain of command and what is the span of management. They are actually both connected. So before we go further, we have to understand the structure first. So if you haven't gone through, or if you have any doubts about the structure of the organization, then do clarify yourself first. Then you can understand these two concepts here. So chain of command. What is chain of command? Is the clear and distinct line of authority among the positions of the organizations. So distinct line of authority. What we are saying is when you have seen that skeleton of the organization, that the structure of the organization based on different factors, the line of relationship we are referring to is who is reporting to who. So CEO is the head, then we have the director of customer service, then we may have the director of sales, you may have the director of finance, who all the directors are reporting to CEO. Then under each director they have the subordinates. So this is called the line of authority, how this is being structured. And chain of command, we have unity of command and scalar principle. In unity of command, we are talking about each person has a clear reporting relationship to one boss. And scalar principle, we are talking about the clear and unbroken line of authority from the lowest to highest position. So the scalar principle is actually the skeleton, the structure from top to bottom. So that is called scalar principle. And unity of command, we are talking about the reporting relationships. So that means who is your boss or how many bosses you have. Normally we don't have more than one boss, but sometimes we may have one or two bosses. But here we're talking about mainly the reporting thing. Of course you may have multiple bosses, but your first reporting point will be you only one boss. So that is called reporting relationship, and that is the unity of command. And based on that, you can actually structure your organization more perfectly. And based on your span of control, your unit of command, we have something called span of management. So span of management is about how many subordinates you are putting under each manager. So this is the number that the people who report to a particular manager. So is it one or is it two, or is it three? That depends on the situations. So span of management is about number of people who report to a particular manager. And there is a three factor based theories here. Uh, Three kinds of interactions. One is direct, cross, and group. So direct means managers one-to-one relationship with their workers. Cross means subordinate relationships among themselves. So when managers deal with a workers, that is called one-to-one. Cross means subordinates, like you work for a manager. When you deal with your colleagues, that is kind of a cross, across. And group relationships within the group of subordinates. So that may be within your department, that may also be the outside of your department. And here there is a quantified formula that we may apply within an organization to find out how many number of interactions or how many number of subordinates that you need to put in an organization. So here I we refer to the number of interaction with and among the subordinates, and n is the total number of subordinates, and each additional subordinate add more complexity than the previous one. So what we are saying is when you determine your number of subordinates, you have to consider that how many subordinates you are placing it. And based on that, you can find out how many interactions that they may have before they come back to you, before they reach to a decision, before they reach to a conclusions about any matter or any issues. So if you know how many subordinates that you have, then of course you can find out within this formula how many interactions that you can have within your organizations. And of course these three categories of interactions will lead you to find out how your span of management can be structured, and this is what we call narrow versus wide, and this will be better be understood with a figure which I will show you very soon. Before we go for the structure in terms of narrow and wide, we have to know about a little bit more about narrow and wide spans. So here, Mr. David described two spans. One is operative span, which can have up to 30 number of subordinates, and that is for the lower level managers, and an executive span that is up to 9, which is for the middle and top managers. So these are guidelines about how many number of subordinates that you should have. And another theory, they have suggested that executive spans should never exceed 6 subordinates. So there are some overlaps among these theories. So these are again guidelines and hypotheses, but ultimately they vary from situation to situation. Now let's look at the figure about narrow and wide span. So here in this figure, as you can see, I have produced two figures here. One is tall and flat. So in tall and flat, the difference, can you spot the difference for can you just pause for a second and find out what's the difference between these two pictures, two structures? Of course, one is tall and one flat. Can you just, without knowing any further, just find out the difference between these two, even it's related to departmentalizations? So of course, perhaps figure out there is a difference about departmentalization, and of course the overall span of control. So here you see is going from top down, is increasing from top to down, not from across. So from here you have two subordinates for the CEO or president. Then within each you have another two. Then within each you have another two. So for each you have another two. So each way you are going from top to down in terms of span of control or chain of command, and that is called tall. So that is why it's going from top to down, it's increasing the size, increasing the number of subordinates from top to bottom. So that is why it's called tall. But if you come back and look at this flat, you see there is no top to down. Top to down is not applicable here, rather we are going across. So from left to right or right to left, whichever way you go. So here under CEO or the president, you have 6 subordinates, and within each subordinates you have 4 sub-subordinates. So you see they are going across. You can add more line here, like you can add another 4 here, but still you have the subordinates which is wide. So this is tall and this is wide. And why we call this wide or flat? Because you are going across, and here you are going top to down. So that is how this tall and flat structure works. So in tall we have narrow span of control, we can say that, and in flat we have wide span of control. So that's the difference between tall and flat organization, and that is the also difference between wide and narrow span of control. In wide span of control, as you can see here, in flat organization you go from across, like from here to here, left to right, and here in tall, which is the narrow span of control, you have less number of subordinates. So I can now conclude and hypothesize that in a tall organization the span of control is narrow, and for each subordinates there is lesser number of subordinates. So here the subordinates is 1, and under one subordinate there is 2, but here in flat this is wide span of control, and the number of subordinates for each subordinates is higher than the tall organization or than the narrow organization or narrow span of control. So that's how these two types of structure within an organization, they vary and differ. So there are different factors that we need to consider before we actually close things off regarding the span of management, regarding the tall versus flat structure. So of course you have to consider the competency of the supervisor and the subordinates. You do also have to consider the physical dispersions. The greater dispersion, the narrower the potential span. So like dispersion means their presence, their spread, their availability of different areas. Extent of non-supervisory work in manager jobs. The more non-supervisory work, the narrower the potential span. So when you have less number of supervisors, it becomes narrow. So that is again kind of a tall. Degree of required interactions. The less number of required interaction, the wider the potential span. So when you have no interaction at all, it gets more wideness within your structure. Extent of standardized procedures. If there are more procedures, it gets more wide span. So when you have so many steps to consider, so many steps to pass before you reach to a conclusion, before you reach to a decision, that actually create a wider span of potential in terms of control. Similarity of tasks. If the tasks are more similar, it gets more wider potential span. Frequency of new problems. If this is in high frequency, the narrow the potential span. So there are different factors that applicable to here in terms of when you select your organization. That is the thing. So based on these factors, you can now decide which types of structure you are going to follow. Are you going to follow tall? Are you going to follow narrow? Are you going to follow wide span or narrow span of control? So that's how it works. So again, just to close things up, we have to consider the departmentalizations based on their different factors. You have to consider their advantages, disadvantages, and then of course you have to consider their tall and flat level of structure within the narrow or wide span of control. And when you do so, these 8 or 7 factors, they are mostly going to be useful for determining which type of structure are going to be applicable to your organization. So that will be all for this chapter, and thank you very much.